among the youngest captains of the Navy, and a woman whose beauty could rival Boa Hancock, the pirate empress. She had short red hair that perfectly matched her serious demeanor, and a well-toned, athletic body, a clear testament to years spent honing her combat skills. Her hands, unlike those of other young women, were marked with scars and calluses. Her name was Carmine Marceline. Yet, now this woman stood aboard a pirate ship as a crewmate. The ship belonged to the Straw Hat Pirates, who, after the War of the Best, had returned to the sea stronger than ever after a 2-year hiatus. Even the crew themselves found it strange that a marine captain had resigned to become a pirate. But why? Nami, the Straw Hat navigator who didn't fully trust the former marine, approached Carmine as she was speaking with the ship's captain, Monkey D. Luffy. With a simple question, she asked, "Why do you want to become a pirate? You had a good life in the Marines." As Nami's question hung in the air, every crew member turned their heads, their curiosity evident. Carmine, who had been smiling moments ago, now wore a somber expression. The question had stirred memories she wasn't keen to revisit, but she knew she had to share the real reason behind her decision to become a pirate. With a faint smile, she made a request of the crew's cook, Sanji. "Sanji-san, could you prepare a drink? My story's long and might bore you." Surprised by the request, Sanji nodded and headed to the kitchen to prepare a drink and some snacks. As the crew waited, Carmine, still smiling, began her tale. "I was about 5 years old when I lost my father. Back then I swore I'd always follow his path. You see, he died fighting pirates. That's pretty much all I know about his death." The crew, puzzled, exchanged glances as if silently asking, "What does this have to do with your decision?" Carmine, laughing lightly, said, "Didn't you all say you wanted to hear the story from the start?" Zoro, uninterested, replied bluntly, "Yeah, but not that far back." Carmine chuckled faintly, her smile now tinged with a hint of inner conflict, and continued, "Well, from that young age I decided to fight. To me, life wasn't just a game. My father always told me life was more than childish games, but ironically, he lost his life to the power games of this world. From that day on, I had only one goal: to carry on my father's legacy and ensure his death wasn't meaningless. Many told me that strength should take precedence over emotions, but I've always sought the truth. And the truth was that the Navy cared more about power and superficial order than true justice." The Straw Hat crew, listening silently to Carmine's words, realized she carried a heavy burden in her heart. As she continued her story, Carmine slowly revisited the painful moments of her past. "My father always used to say, if you want to see the real world, you have to break free from the rules forced upon you. And I did just that." Robin, who was still trying to piece together the story, asked, "Then why did you leave the Navy?" Carmine, understanding Robin's question easily, replied, "I probably never would have done it if I hadn't met Luffy." Everyone, shocked by her answer, exclaimed, "Luffy! It's Luffy!" Carmine, equally surprised by their reaction, said, "Aren't you all the same? Didn't meeting Luffy change your lives too?" Sanji, returning from the kitchen with drinks and snacks, placed them on the table and responded, "Yeah, but it's not like we'd say it so confidently. After all, it's Luffy we're talking about." Luffy, entirely indifferent to the conversation, lunged at the snacks, only to receive a swift kick from Sanji. Carmine, more surprised by Sanji's reaction than his words, pointed at the sprawled-out Luffy and asked, "Is it normal?" Frankie, in his usual tone, replied, "As normal as it gets." Not wanting the topic to derail further, Carmine continued her story. "I think I was about 18. I was chasing a pirate I'd been tracking for some time, and I found out he'd gone to Fuchsia village. So I followed him there. That's where I came across a 16-year-old boy training in the forest. I watched him for a while, and eventually, Luffy, who had finally managed to grab some snacks, spoke mid-bite. "Oh yeah, I remember. You suddenly hit me on the head, yelling something about how I was training wrong and how clumsy I was." Carmine, smiling at the memory, continued, "Honestly, you did annoy me. You were punching a tree like a monkey." Luffy, unfazed by the insult, kept eating as Carmine went on. "After that, I taught him the proper way to punch. You wouldn't believe it, but this guy took up my entire day before he could finally throw a decent punch. And then we went for a little walk. Luffy was surprised that I was a Marine. And when I found out he wanted to become a pirate, I laughed until my stomach hurt. While we were walking, Luffy said something that made me think for a long time. Do you remember Luffy?" Luffy, who was now trying to sneak to the fridge, but got caught by Sanji and was taking another beating, replied, "Huh, I said something." Carmine nodded, and Luffy continued, saying he didn't remember. So, Carmine began speaking again. "Back then, when we were saying goodbye, I asked you that if you ever decided to become a Marine, you should come find me. But you replied, why would I want to be a Marine when I already have true freedom? And after that, you were the one who asked me that if I ever decided to become a pirate, I should come find you." Brooke, who seemed to have just gotten the answer to his question, laughed and said, "So that's why you asked Luffy-san if he was still keeping his word when we were in Sabayodi?" Nami sighed in frustration and added, "Yeah, I was terrified at that moment, thinking Luffy made another reckless promise to someone." Chopper agreed with her. "Exactly. Especially since you came after us with a Marine ship, shouting at Luffy, and then suddenly jumping onto the ship." Zoro, sipping from his drink, added, "And then you swore loyalty to Luffy." Carmine, now looking a bit embarrassed, replied, "I'm really sorry about that. I completely acted on instinct." She then quickly shifted the topic back to her story. "After Luffy told me those words and we parted ways, I couldn't stop thinking about it for months. Was I really doing the right thing? I had followed my father's path without any choice, without even knowing why I was doing it. For years, I convinced myself with the idea that I was helping people." Sanji, now tired from kicking a Luffy, asked, "So what happened 2 years ago?" Carmine, who had been recounting her story with a smile, now looked somber and answered, 2 years ago, I was at the War of the Best. That's when I saw the true face of the Marines' politics." Luffy, now taking the matter seriously, said, "So that's why you helped me? You saved me several times back there." Carmine, still looking down, replied, "At that time, I didn't know why I was doing it. I just felt like I had to help you more because my heart told me to. When I heard the story about your brother, Port Gas D. Ace, I was overwhelmed with anger. They hated him simply because he was the son of a father he never wanted to be associated with, for something he never did. He was cursed and judged. Your brother made the right choice, the choice anyone in his place would have made." Nami, uncertain of the answer, hesitated before asking, "And what was that?" Carmine looked at her briefly and then lowered her head again. "Your brother, Luffy. He chose to become a pirate because he couldn't live a normal life. He was probably like me, searching for answers. The answer to why his father chose such a dangerous path. The Marines investigate the family history of anyone who rises in their ranks. So even if your brother had decided to become a Marine, he would have been secretly executed in the end." Everyone in the group agreed with Carmine's words, but still didn't fully understand her decision. Carmine continued, "At that moment, I wanted to shout and throw this truth in Sengoku's face. But in the end, I stopped myself by convincing myself he was just a pirate. During the battle, I saw Whitebeard fighting alongside his men for the freedom of his enemy's son. But Sengoku, he just stood there, watching. With a wave of anger that everyone present could feel, she added, it was as if he was watching a play he himself had orchestrated. He was the leader of the Marines. He should have stepped in, should have fought Whitebeard alongside his men. But instead, he was just a spectator." Carmine continued, "At that moment, I saw that the Navy was nothing more than a corrupt system. When I saw Sengoku, instead of fighting alongside his forces, just standing by as a spectator, I became disgusted with myself. Everything became clear to me. I had always thought that this path was the right one, that it was my duty to follow my father's steps. But in the end, I realized that this system could only bring pain and suffering." The entire Straw Hat crew was silent. The only sounds were the waves and the wind gently whispering in their ears. Only Carmine was sharing her feelings. And for the first time, Luffy, with his usual look full of passion and courage, ended the silence. "So, that's how you became a pirate," Luffy said. And this time, there was a true and deep understanding in his eyes. "For freedom, so you could live life your own way." Carmine looked at Luffy with a soft gaze and shook her head. "Yeah, Luffy, so that nothing could control me anymore. So I wouldn't have to be like a pawn in someone's hands who doesn't care about the truth. So I could help people the way they need and the way I want." She paused and then continued, "When I decided to take this path, I no longer wanted to die for the Navy or lose my life for their cruel orders. I wanted to follow what I truly wanted, not what was imposed on me." Frankie laughed loudly. "Well, looks like we're pretty alike. We all decided one day to follow our own path, not the one the world wants us to take." Zoro, strangely combining seriousness and humor, said quietly, "Everyone finds their own world in their own way." Carmine lowered her head, then stood up. "All right, now that I've said all this, maybe you understand why I became a pirate. But there's still one thing left for me, something I've never been able to answer." Everyone looked at her, eyes full of curiosity. Carmine continued, "That question has always been, why do those who know the truth have to live in the darkest parts of the underground world? Why must we always make hard decisions just because we see the truth? Do you have an answer to this? I've reached some conclusions myself, but I'd love to hear your thoughts." At that moment, Luffy stood up and, with his usual grin, said, "Because that's what makes life meaningful, right? When you face the truth, you realize how much you're willing to fight for it." Carmine looked at Luffy, silent for a long moment, then said, "Maybe you're right. Maybe that's what makes life meaningful." For a few moments, everyone remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Even Zoro, who usually didn't pay attention at times like this, was listening to Carmine's story. But Luffy, always simple and direct, suddenly laughed and said, "Well, so you came to the conclusion that freedom is more important than anything else? That's great. Now you're one of us." Carmine, surprised by Luffy's simple and unpretentious reaction, smiled and said, "Yeah, maybe you're right. You can experience true freedom here, with you all." Sanji, still busy pouring drinks for everyone, smiled and said, "Well, at least now we have someone who understands the value of this ship and this crazy captain." Robin, in her quiet voice, added, "Maybe that's because we all have a past that led us to choose this ship. You've become one of us, Carmine." Carmine nodded and said, "Yeah, maybe you're right. But there's one thing I'm still not sure about." Nami asked curiously. "What thing?" Carmen glanced at Luffy and said, "Can I really forget everything I've been through and accept this new life? Can I become a real pirate?" Luffy replied excitedly, "You already are one of us. Being a pirate means doing whatever you want, protecting the things that are important to you. So you're already a real pirate." Luffy's words, though simple, carried a certain weight. Carmen smiled and thought to herself that maybe this new life could lighten the burden she had carried for years. One by one, the members of the Straw Hat crew came to Carmen and talked to her. Each shared a part of their story with her and reminded her that this ship was a place for everyone, even for those with a past full of wounds and pain. That night, Carmen felt for the first time that maybe she truly belonged somewhere, a place where neither power nor rules, but the hearts of people determined